Hello, everyone. Welcome to our program today, Jewish Languages, Commonality, and Diversity. My name is Rachel King. I am the Executive Director of the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at American Ancestors, and I will be your moderator today. The Jewish Heritage Center is an archive and educational center dedicated to preserving New England Jewish history, exploring Jewish heritage, and illuminating the American Jewish experience for wide audiences. We are located in Boston at American Ancestors, a national center for history, heritage, and culture. Today, we're excited to learn about the diversity of Jewish languages over centuries and continents. But before we get started, I just want to make a few housekeeping notes about the webinar. You in the audience will be muted and off camera, but we'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. You can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen anytime during the presentation, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can following the presentation. I also want to mention that as we are broadcasting from different locations today, we hope you'll bear with us if we experience any technical difficulties. And even if there are any issues on your end or on ours, excuse me, we will be sending a link to the recording of this session for you to watch later. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Sarah Bunin-Bonor is Vice Provost and Professor of Contemporary Jewish Studies at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. She is also adjunct professor in the University of Southern California Linguistics Department. She is the author of the books Becoming Frum: How Newcomers Learn the Language and Culture of Orthodox Judaism, and Hebrew Infusion: Language and Community at American Jewish Summer Camps. And she's written extensively about Jewish languages and American Jews. Sarah Bonor received her PhD in linguistics from Stanford University. She co-edits the Journal of Jewish Languages and is the founding director of the Jewish Language Project, which features the Jewish language website and the Jewish English lexicon. She joins us today from Los Angeles. Without further ado, welcome, Sarah Bonor.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, and thanks to all of you for attending this webinar. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see some images. And I'm going to start with a map. And you can see in the middle of the map, a purple space, which is the land of Israel, where the Jewish people originated. And when Jews left the land of Israel, they went to parts of Asia, North Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and in each of those places they encountered a language, and they tended to pick up those languages and Judeify them, leading to language varieties like Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-French, Judeo-Georgian, etc. The two most famous Jewish languages are actually exceptions in this history: Yiddish and Ladino. Ladino was born in the Iberian Peninsula, and when Jews were expelled from there, from Spain, they ended up in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Ottoman Empire, and other places as well. But specifically in the Ottoman Empire and in Morocco, they maintained their Spanish language, and it developed further, leading to what we know today as Ladino. And similarly, Yiddish was also maintained for centuries away from the land where it originated. Jews moved from Italy and France to what's now Germany and picked up the German language and Judaified it. But instead of just speaking it there, they also took it with them when they moved to other places to the east, including Hungary and Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania, where they spoke languages that were not Germanic. So both Yiddish and Ladino developed alongside languages that were totally different from their own, unlike most of the languages in the Jewish diaspora history. So today, there are new languages that have developed in Latin America and the United States and the former British Empire based on the migration patterns that Jews who spoke these long-standing languages moved to these new places and took on new languages like Jewish Swedish, Jewish French, Jewish Latin American Spanish, Jewish English, etc. And in Israel, new varieties of recent immigrant languages there are developing, like Israeli Russian, Israeli Amharic, and Israeli French. So that's just a general overview of when Jewish languages, how Jewish languages arose. But what I want to focus on today is the commonalities among those Jewish languages. Now, some people say you aren't a Jewish language unless you have these attributes, but my take on it is a little bit more expansive, and I say these are common attributes that are not required, but are often the case with Jewish languages. So I also like to use a metaphor of flatbread, that the non-Jewish base language, such as Arabic, Greek, Persian, etc., that these languages are considered the non-Jewish base language. And then the way that Jews speak these languages has a repertoire of distinctive Jewish features. And apologies to those of you on the East Coast for whom it's dinner time and who have not yet eaten, because this is going to make you hungry. I know that looks really delicious. I think I'm going to go home and make that for dinner myself tonight. But the idea is that those tomatoes and pine nuts and basil represent the distinctive linguistic features that make the Jewish language variety different from its co-territorial non-Jewish base language. So what are those distinctive features? Well, maybe I'll make that one instead. That looks even better with those figs. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the food here. So what are the distinctive linguistic features? Well, to answer that question, first I need to tell you the common attributes of Jewish communities. And then for each of them, I will tell you a linguistic feature that stems from that attribute. So first, Jews around the world share religious observance and Hebrew and Aramaic sacred texts. Jews also have a history of migrations, both within current countries and outside of current countries, so cross-border migrations and internal migrations. Also, Jews throughout history have had various externally imposed restrictions, such as where they can live and what occupations they can have and where they can go to school. And also beyond the externally indicated features, we also have internal features of communal insularity, the idea that the community should be somewhat distinct from its surrounding society. And finally, throughout history, Jews have maintained diasporic ties to Israel and had visits to Israel and migrations to Israel. But in the modern period, from the 19th century to the present, there has also been a much more sizable tendency of transnational orientation with regard to the state of Israel. So what types of distinctive Jewish linguistic features do these attributes of Jewish communities engender? So the religious observance in Hebrew and Aramaic sacred texts lead to Hebrew and Aramaic loanwords. A loanword is a word that originates in one language but is used in another language. And also, Jewish languages throughout history have had Hebrew writing systems. And I'm going to give you examples of each of these, but let me just give you the overview so you have a sense of where we're going here. So the cross-border migrations lead to language shift, that people who spoke, let's say, Judeo-Italian and Judeo-French shifted to a Germanic language. And the internal migrations within a country led to what's called displaced dialectalism, features of one variety of a language used in a different region. The restrictions and the communal insularity led to archaic features and innovations. Archaic features are features that Jews continued to use as their neighbors stopped using them. And the innovations or other distinctive features are things that Jews changed about their language where their non-Jewish neighbors did not. And finally, the diasporic ties to Israel and the transnational orientation in the modern period have led to modern Hebrew influence, especially in the lexicon, in the words that are used, but also in how Hebrew words are pronounced. So now I'm going to give you examples of these common attributes of Jewish languages, and we're going to start with Hebrew and Aramaic loanwords. So as you might expect, this was quite common for Hebrew and Aramaic words to be used for religious items and concepts. You see this in Shabbat greetings. This graphic shows you some Shabbat greetings from around the world, and you can see how most of them have a form of the word Shabbat in them. It's pronounced differently in each place, ranging from Shabbat to Sabbat to Senbet, which actually probably is cognate within Amharic because it is a Semitic language, Jewish Portuguese Saban, Shalom in Juhuri, etc., Shabbos in Yiddish. So we have all different ways of pronouncing this word, but note that all of the words surrounding them are quite different, ranging from good to feliz, to shalom, to umvorach, right? So we have all different greetings surrounding that word Shabbat, some of which are from Hebrew and some of which are not. Also, here are a number of words for peace, and you can see that the word shalom appears in many of them. So it's not just words for the religious domain, but also words that come from our liturgy, but are used for to refer to other concepts. So obviously the word shalom comes from Jewish texts. We say it in the central prayer of the Amidah, for example, Oseh Shalom, may God who creates peace. So then also here are some other examples of how these Hebrew words are integrated into the languages. For example, Judeo-Arabic, il masa b'ta afikumen, and sorry for my pronunciation there, but the idea is you can see the words matzah and afikomen, but also the Arabic morphology that comes along with it in Judeo-Arabic. Or in Jewish Malayalam, minyan kuti, which means a boy had his bar mitzvah. You can see the word minyan in there. And also, this is from southern India, also the word kuti, which comes from Malayalam. And then sometimes these words come to be used metaphorically, like mezuzah in Judeo-Italian, which means both the mezuzah on the doorpost and a beautiful woman. Why a beautiful woman? Well, because the male who said this phrase decided that a beautiful woman is someone he would want to kiss, just as people kiss the mezuzah as they walk by the door. So in addition to religious items and related things, we have secret language that comes from Hebrew and Aramaic words. Why would Jews use Hebrew and Aramaic words when they wanted to be secretive? Because that is a language that their non-Jewish neighbors most likely did not have access to. Here's an example of this. Daber nicht, der Orel is maven kol dibber. Literally, don't speak. The uncircumcised one understands every word. This would have been said in the context of a setting where the people around them did not speak German, but one Jew wants to warn another Jew that someone nearby does understand German. And because Yiddish and German are pretty close, they can't just use the words they would normally use, like red nicht, versteht, was du sagst. You can't say that if the person speaks German. So instead, you use a secretive sentence that is primarily Hebrew words for the big words, and then the little words and the grammatical words are from German. as is the sentence structure. So he's not actually speaking Hebrew. If this happened today, the two Jews would probably just speak Hebrew, right? Like al tidaber, hu mevin, right? And so, but in this case, this was before modern Hebrew, and so instead they used these words, but in a Germanic sentence structure. So you also have a lot of words for non-Jewish holiday and non-Jew and even Jesus that come from Hebrew and Aramaic. And you can see how in some cases it's the same word pronounced differently, like we saw with Shabbat, but then you also have slightly different words. So sometimes you have arel, or in this case it's pronounced ngarel because that ayin is pronounced as a ng in Judeo-Italian. But other cases, other words for non-Jew like goy. And then this one is interesting. It's a euphemism because in a rabbinic text where they didn't want to say the name of Jesus, instead they just said that man. That's a euphemism. Or in another example is a word for Jesus is tole, which means talui, or the hanging one. So we also have other examples of euphemism when it comes to body parts and other taboo topics. So for example, in Judeo-Greek, you have the word ruchoth, which means airs, but it also means farts. And then you have the word rimonim, which means pomegranates and also breasts. And tachath, which means under and rear end. And that's the same word as you might have heard from Yiddish, tuchis. One of my favorites is Yiddish asher yotzer papir, which means literally the one who creates paper. Now that doesn't make sense, but it does if you know that asher yatzar is the blessing that is said after people use the bathroom. And so it makes sense to call the paper that you use in the bathroom the paper that relates to that blessing that you say after you use the bathroom. Another example of euphemism is Shmuel Michal Kalman for male genitalia. Why? Because the first letters of those male names put together make the word shmuck, which means penis in Yiddish. You came to this talk about language, little did you know you would get male genitalia. Okay. So then we also have Hebrew and Aramaic words used for things that do not have real life reference. For example, a lot of connective language that comes from the rabbinic texts, like in Judeo-German or Western Yiddish, bekitzer and tekef umiyad, and Judeo-Arabic, afilu and vadai. Or Jewish English, here's a sentence, if you're going, then kal v'chomer, I should go. So these are words that aren't just referring to Jewish religious concepts or euphemism or secret language. They're just words that come to be used in everyday conversation. So I've explained the Hebrew and Aramaic loanwords. Now let's turn to the Hebrew writing system. I'm just going to show you a few examples of translations of Bereshit, the beginning of the Torah, into various Jewish languages. Here's one from the 16th century, translated into Persian, but notice here's the Hebrew, here's the Persian, it says Parsi, but it's not written in Arabic letters like Persian is. It is written in Hebrew letters, but these are Persian words. Similarly, this is a Judeo-Arabic translation. Actually, you have one sentence in Hebrew, that same sentence translated into Aramaic, Bereshit bara, Bekadmin bara, and then an Arabic version of that. But again, the Arabic is not written in Arabic letters, it's written in Hebrew letters, as are many Jewish languages. Here's an example from Yiddish, Bereshit bara, in onhe, hotkot, bashafin, etc., etc. What about Jewish English? Well, we don't do this. So here's an example of a poster that I found in an Orthodox community. And you can see that the English words are not written in Hebrew letters like those other texts. Instead, most of it's written in English letters or Latin letters, but sometimes words are inserted in Hebrew letters, like Kedusha, Tefillah, that's holiness and prayer, etc. So then here's an example from a pedagogical context where this is a textbook, and you can see how these words that refer to liturgical concepts are written in Hebrew letters, even though the rest of the words are written in English. So why is this? Why are contemporary Jewish languages generally not written in Hebrew letters? Well, it has to do with the increased literacy in general in our society. At the times when Judeo-Arabic, Yiddish, Ladino, etc., were developing, most Jews did not have the kind of education that we have today. They weren't expected to be literate in the surrounding language. Today, there is much more widespread literacy, and we are expected to be literate. So in older times, when people would learn these languages, they would learn them with the same alphabet that they learned their holy texts in. In our schools today, even our Jewish day schools, Jews are learning Hebrew text, but they're learning English in English letters with aligned with the expectations for literacy. So the next attribute I want to focus on is the previous Jewish language based on the cross-border migrations. So in the case of Yiddish, I mentioned that Jews moved from what's now France and Italy to Germanic lands, and there are influences from their Romance languages. An example is the word bench. This is one of my favorite words. It means to bless. Where does it come from? Well, in German, the way you say to bless is segnen, which means literally to make the sign, as in make the sign of the cross. Jews, understandably, were uncomfortable with that concept that the way you say bless is the way you say making the sign of the cross. And so what they did was they maintained a word that maybe they heard from their grandparents who spoke Italian, benedice. And then benedice over the years became bench, and we still use that word today in Jewish English. Another example of a Romance element in Yiddish is cholent, which comes from the French chalent, and it means to heat, because that is a food that heats slowly. That is, it's a stew that's eaten by Jews on Shabbat during the day. So then another example of previous Jewish languages are Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Greek influences in Judeo-Spanish or Ladino. When Jews lived in the Iberian Peninsula, they spoke Arabic originally, because that's what everyone spoke there. And then there was the conquest of the Christians, Catholics in the Iberian Peninsula, and the Spanish language spread, as well as other Romance languages spread there. But Jews maintained some words that they had spoken in Judeo-Arabic and also in Judeo-Greek, which they had spoken previously. An example from Judeo-Arabic is al-had, which means the one. That is the word for Sunday in Ladino. Why? Because in Spanish, the way you say Sunday is domingo, which means Lord. And Jews don't see Sunday as the Lord's Day. Instead, they see it as the first day of the week. So they maintain that Arabic word for it. And Judeo-Greek influence example is meldar, which means to read, from the Greek meleteo. And in fact, the word meldar is still used today in Sephardic communities in America who refer to the anniversary of someone's death as the meldado. Why? Because there is a tradition of learning or studying Jewish texts in memory of the person who died. So they might say, I'm going to call for my nono's meldado, which means I'm going to synagogue for my grandfather's study session, memorial study session. So what about Jewish English and Jewish Swedish and Jewish Hungarian? In these contemporary Jewish languages, we have hundreds of words and constructions from Yiddish. And in specific communities, there are also influences from other languages like Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Persian, etc. And there are many examples of this in the Jewish English lexicon, which is a dictionary that I run. If you just Google Jewish English lexicon later, you'll find it. And you'll find that each entry has pronunciations and definitions and who tends to use it. So there's a lot of information there about the previous Jewish language. So then I'm going to explain what displaced dialectalism is, which comes from the internal migration. So when Jews live in a country, but then they move from place to place within that country, that leads to some displaced geographic features. For example, Judeo-Arabic is spoken in many different countries. And in general, the way that Jews speak in Morocco is much more similar to the way that Muslims in Morocco speak Arabic than how Jews speak in Egypt, right? So Jews are basically speaking the Arabic variety of their country, but there are some examples of displaced geographic features, like some Jews in Egypt use forms that come from Morocco. Morocco and Egypt are pretty far apart, but there was migration of Jews from Morocco to Egypt, and you see that reflected in their language. Another example is in Judeo-Italian, where Jews from the north use a plural article that is used primarily in the south, and it's not used by their non-Jewish neighbors in the north, but it's because of that internal migration. And finally, an example from Jewish English, where Jews outside of New York use New York pronunciations, like saying orange and horrible instead of orange and horrible. Another example of this is Neo-Aramaic dialects. If you look at Christian and Jewish dialects from the same region, you find that the Jewish dialects have more in common with each other than with the nearby Christian ones. An example is just the words for big, for example. It's urwa, and urwa, but here it's gora. And so that's it's similar, but it's different enough that you can tell by listening who is Jewish and Christian. And you can also see that this is an example of how Jews are migrating within regions and also maintaining contacts with their Jewish brethren in other parts of their language territories. Next, we have archaisms. Based on these residential and occupational restrictions and communal insularity. An example is from Judeo-Georgian, spoken in the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia, where they use some archaic words like a term of endearment, where Jews would say da genatvle, and non-Jews would say genatvale. So similar, but different. And that's because Jews are maintaining an earlier form of that word, whereas non-Jews have shifted to a new way of saying it, because the norm in language in general is change. Languages always change, and sometimes some groups don't follow that change if there is some degree of social separation there. Another example is from Juhuri, also known as Judeo-Tat, spoken in Azerbaijan and Dagestan, where you have some archaic morphosyntax. So, for example, at the end of a clause, you have a conjunction or a particular mood within the language. These are things that do not exist in the non-Jewish variety of Tat anymore. They used to, but the Jews kept using them when the non-Jews stopped using them. Another example is words for God in Jewish Malayalam from southern India, where these examples of these words are no longer used by their Hindu and Muslim neighbors. Here's an example of an archaism in pronunciation. In Judeo-Spanish, you have at the beginning of the word, some H's are pronounced as F, Why? Because that's what they were in Latin. In fact, in Latin, you probably know the English word filial comes from Latin, and that it means son, right? And that is how you say in Judeo-Spanish, sons is fijos, as opposed to Spanish hijos, because that H at the beginning of the word comes from the F from Latin to Spanish, and then eventually disappears, so you don't even pronounce it as hijos, you say hijos. Another archaism in Spanish, in Judeo-Spanish, is Dio, which used to be the way you would say God, but it changed such that they started saying Dios as a way of kind of Latinizing how they're referring to God. And then they stopped saying Dio. They said Dios, but Jews kept saying Dio because they're like, what do you mean Dios? There's only one God. And so actually that became a false etymology that Jews, the idea is that Jews, that originally the word was Dios and Jews changed it to Dio, but that's actually not how it happened. They originally said Dio, and then they kept saying Dio, even though their Christian neighbors Latinized their word for God to Dios. And finally, an example from Jewish English, where Orthodox Jews will sometimes have archaic words like saying supper instead of dinner, or some archaic vowels like saying candle as opposed to candle, whereas non-Jews in America tend and non-Orthodox Jews tend to change that vowel of a to a when it comes before n or m, like camp and man instead of camp and man. But in Orthodox communities, there's an archaic pronunciation of that, which is more like yeah. And finally, other distinctive features, innovations. So we have examples from Judeo-Spanish, where in Spanish you say verde, it means green, but in Judeo-Spanish, vedre. Why? The R and the D just switch places. It's called metathesis, and it's a common linguistic phenomenon. But why did it happen in Judeo-Spanish and not in Spanish? Because of the separation of Jews from Spanish. They were not in the Iberian Peninsula. They were in Turkey and Greece. Another example is Iraqi Judeo-Arabic, where Muslims pronounce a certain sound as sh, and Jews pronounce it as s. So this is literally a shibboleth, a word that, or a sound that that informs people who someone is, who the speaker is, just based on how they pronounce it. And Jewish English, another distinctive feature that isn't related to the text, isn't related to Yiddish influence, is that T is released frequently at the end of a word, like saying right as opposed to right, or distinctive intonation, like if you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. So we turn now to the final category of diasporic ties to Israel and visits and migrations, where you have influence from modern Hebrew. Words like kippah and kol hakavod, yofi, matzav, tiyul, and shilshul. So some of these are words in the religious domain, like kippah meaning a skull cap, kol hakavod meaning good job, literally all the honor. Yofi is an evaluation, like nice, good job. Matzav means situation, which is often used to refer to the political situation in Israel. Tiyul meaning a trip, and shilshul meaning diarrhea. So these are words that some of them would be used in an American context. Some of them might be used on a trip to Israel. We also have influence in Hebrew pronunciation. Well, most Ashkenazi Jews in America originally pronounced the holiday of the Day of Atonement as Yom Kippur, but then switched to Yom Kippur sometime in the mid-20th century as a response to modern Hebrew becoming the norm, and especially in Jewish educational contexts. saying Sukkot and mitzvot instead of sukkos and mitzvahs. Also, an Israeli influence is the click, saying that click in the middle of a sentence, like we were walking around and, oh, it doesn't matter. That click is an influence from Israeli Hebrew, as is the word so, like saying, if you go to Israel, so you'll see this. That so is an influence from Israeli Hebrew as. So in conclusion, I have presented here a new understanding of Jewish languages, that Jews tend to speak the local language with the selective use of a repertoire of distinctive features, the flatbread with the ingredients on it. And Yiddish and Ladino, even though people think of them as the models for Jewish languages, they are, but they're also exceptions in Jewish linguistic history because they were maintained for centuries away from the places where they originated. And there's a continuum of Jewish linguistic distinctiveness from the least distinct languages like Judeo-Persian and Jewish Amharic that are very similar to the surrounding languages, to the most distinct like Yiddish and Ladino. And wherever Jews have lived, their languages have had some distinctive features, and it's up to us as analysts to determine where they are on this continuum. Also, the influences from Hebrew and Aramaic have varied widely depending on how religious a community it is, how much textual learning they have. And the influences from previous Jewish languages and displaced dialectalism have varied depending on the migration patterns of that Jewish community. And all of these features have varied depending on how integrated the community is within the surrounding society. And then the modern Hebrew influences have varied depending on the Zionist orientation of the given community or individual. So this understanding of Jewish linguistic distinctiveness enables us to compare Jewish communities around the world. And you can also think about this in relation to other cultural domains like music, cuisine, art, etc. You can think of how all of these have influences from our textual tradition, from previous Jewish cultures, from Jews being somewhat distinct. And here's just a timeline of the many languages Jews have spoken throughout history, from ancient Hebrew, which arose in the 10th century before the Common Era, to Israeli Sign Language and Jewish Latin American Spanish, which started around the 20th century. And many of these languages, the longstanding ones, are now endangered. Over the past 2 centuries, there have been nationalistic language policies, governments saying you have to study in standard Italian or standard Persian, and that leading to the endangerment of longstanding languages. Migrations and genocides have also played a major role in a lot of these languages becoming endangered. And what's surprising to me is that so many people have not even heard of many of these languages. Many people, including Jews, haven't heard of, they've heard of Yiddish, maybe Ladino, maybe Judeo-Arabic, but it's very rare to find Jews who have heard of Jewish Malayalam or Judeo-Amazigh, which was spoken in Morocco, for example, or Krimchak, which is a Jewish Turkic language spoken by rabbinic Jews in the Crimean Peninsula, or Judeo-Shirazi and Judeo-Esfahani and Jewish Neo-Aramaic spoken in Iran. So because of the lack of linguistic knowledge, I started an initiative at the institution where I work, Hebrew Union College, called the Jewish Language Project. And our mission is to promote research on, awareness about, and engagement surrounding the many languages spoken and written by Jews throughout history and around the world. Why spend a lot of my time on this project when there are so many other things that are important in this world? Well, one is for the speakers themselves. For example, for Galina Anisimova, a speaker of Juhuri from Derbent, Dagestan, which is in the southern part of Russia. Galina wants her language to be recorded, and she recognizes that it is an endangered language, but she doesn't want it to disappear completely without being recorded. Also for those speakers of these endangered languages who've passed away, such as Rachel Gadi, who passed away a few months ago. She was a speaker of Lishan Didan, or Jewish Neo-Aramaic, from Urmia, Iran, from the Kurdish region there. And she was recorded by her grandson, Sam, who is another major reason that we should record these languages before it's too late, because Sam didn't learn Jewish Neo-Aramaic from his parents. They raised him in New York, and the common thing was to raise your kids in English. So they did not pass the language on to him, but in his childhood, he realized that this was sad, and he asked his grandmother to teach it to him, and she did. And today he is one of our interns who is transcribing and translating these languages and helping us with our educational projects. But it's not just for people who have a family connection to these languages that it's important to record them. It's also important for students and scholars who want to understand these communities. The best way to learn about a community is to learn its language and learn all the culture that's embedded in it. It's also important for Jews around the world to know about each other. There are Jewish communities around the world, and people tend to be aware that there are Jews in the United States and in Israel, but maybe they're not aware of all the Jewish communities in smaller communities around the world. So my vision is that by 2045, every known Jewish language variety will be well documented. Jews will be aware of the linguistic diversity of Jewish communities around the world. Jews will feel a stronger connection to faraway Jewish communities, past and present. And I think that's a realistic goal of, I started this project in 2020, so a 25-year intervention in Jewish communal life. And how are we doing that? Well, I'm not going to tell you all the details today, but I just want to show you one example of what we're doing. Our language documentation work, which involves not just recording people, but also making those recordings accessible through subtitles and sharing them on social media, raising awareness about these languages, because if people don't see their language as something worthy of being recorded, then they're not going to come forward and say, yes, you can record me. And then also engaging people with these languages beyond just learning them, because most people aren't going to learn a language. It's a huge commitment, right? So instead of everyone learning it, we recommend that people find other ways to engage if they're not able to make that commitment. And we do this through our partner organizations. We started a consortium called the Jewish Language Consortium of 12 organizations that are doing research and education about endangered Jewish languages. And I'm just going to end with a video of intergenerational connections with endangered Jewish languages and people explaining why they feel it's important to document their endangered Jewish languages.
چی تدریسی که درس کنیم؟ چی تدریسی که درس کنیم برای شامل؟
It's so fast. هده شما
خمه شمارندی حالا بعد از 40 سال ما دیگه از بیرون اومدیم باز حرف
خیلی مدیسید. خیلی مدیسید. میشه من شما رو خیلی دوست دارم.
بله. Eta maçet modo.
I understood the much.
الهامنتي يعني إن شاء الله مخبرم ذن بگیرم الهامنتي سي بختگور بخت لگبرو
لا
لگبت بختگوری
هنا الهامنتي
الهامنتي آفرین الهامنتي
My name is Alon Azizi,
And I'm Adika Dusi.
and our families came to Israel from Sanandaj,
And from Bijar, which is in western Iran.
شالوم اسم من هایده آینچیو من تهران متولد و بیان ولی فامیلام اهل گویندان.
My name is Galit Dardashti, and I'm an anthropologist and vocalist. I grew up in the United States speaking English, but my father grew up speaking Persian in Tehran, and he remembers my grandparents speaking only small phrases of Judeo-Isfahani and Judeo-Hamadani.
The mass immigration of Iranian Jews from Iran left us with a hole in our hearts.
It's so important to record these languages while we still can, because for one, they allow those of us who feel disconnected from our Persian Jewish heritages a way in.
So when I heard about wiki tongues and preservation of old languages, I left a message. I said, that's me. I can really help. And now I'm interviewing people with a passion. I'm interviewing people with the Judeo-Hamadani, Judeo-Kashani, Judeo-Isfahani. And when now I hear Hamadani, it takes me back to the bosom of my beloved grandmother and all the values that she instilled in our family. But this is a race for time.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating, and I have so many questions, and I'm sure our audience does too. Just a reminder to the audience to submit your questions in the Q&A box. Before we turn to questions, I just wanted to mention two upcoming events with the Jewish Heritage Center this spring. On Sunday, May 5th, we host a webinar with the authors of The Counterfeit Countess, a new book just out about a Jewish mathematician who saved thousands of lives in Nazi-occupied Poland by masquerading as a Polish aristocrat. And on June 18th in Boston, we host a special benefit event honoring shoe designer, entrepreneur, and philanthropist Stuart Weitzman. You can learn more about these and other events at jewishheritagecenter.org/events, and we hope you'll join us. Okay, let's turn to your questions. First of all, Sarah, I just wanted to thank you for the work you're doing through the Jewish Language Project and just in general. You know, we hear, of course, our history as a sort of peripatetic people, and we don't learn as much about the languages that were spoken and borrowed from and of Jewish migrations. And also, it sounds like, you know, Jews were sort of leaving an imprint on some local languages as well. So it was sort of working both ways. Just fascinating. I wondered, we do have some audience questions. I wanted to just start by asking, you did mention and you showed a fascinating timeline, which I wanted to study more. So you looked at and obviously spoke about the endangered languages, but you also brought it forward to sort of emerging Jewish languages. And I just wondered if you could give us a sense looking forward of some emerging languages that are particularly interesting to you, that you can just tell us a little bit about?
Sure. Well, I think the way that Jews are speaking in Latin America today is very interesting, in particular in Argentina and Mexico, but everywhere throughout Latin America where there are Jewish communities, because their influences are from Hebrew, like other Jewish languages, and in the case of Ashkenazi communities, from Yiddish, and in the case of Syrian communities, from Judeo-Arabic, and in the case of Ottoman Sephardic communities, from Ladino. So you have all of these influences coming together. And in particular in Mexico City, it's pretty interesting that the communities are still pretty separate. They have their own community centers for Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Damascene, and what they call them, Shami and Halabi Jews, Jews from Damascus and from Aleppo. And so each of those communities maintains some influences from their ancestral languages. And so it's pretty interesting to see how that plays out and to what extent they influence each other. I would also say it's very interesting to look at Bukharian Jewish communities, because there are Bukharian communities in the New York area, in Miami, in Phoenix, in various places. And to what extent do they speak English with influences from their ancestral Bukharian language and from Russian, which was the colonial language that was imposed on Bukharian communities. And so it's just interesting to see how those languages interact with each other.
Fascinating.
And actually, I guess along those same lines, someone in the questions is asking about the American Jewish language, Yeshivish. So I mentioned that Orthodox Jews have some distinctive features in their language, and that is what some Orthodox Jews refer to as Yeshivish, because it's the language of Yeshivish communities, communities where the men attend yeshiva. And it's English with a lot of influences from Yiddish, from Hebrew, from Aramaic, especially from the Talmudic text. And it's used not just in the yeshiva context, but there are actually some great videos of really comedic videos of play-by-play for baseball and football that are in Yeshivish. And they're so different from English that it would be very hard for you to understand it if you weren't familiar with that community in that language.
We have a question here from Cindy. In early 20th century, would it be common for an Orthodox Christian from Russia to speak Yiddish?
No, not common, but it did happen sometimes. For in some Jewish communities, there was more interaction between Jews and non-Jews, and there are examples of this historically, where a Jewish family might have a non-Jewish nanny or person who helped them around the house that learned some Yiddish, but most of the Christians in Russia in the early 20th century would have spoken Russian rather than Yiddish.
Okay. And you talked about the secret language to keep Germans from understanding, and because they might have understood some of the Yiddish or the words that were in common.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of which, Jay asks, has German Jewish been recorded? And I think this came in when you were actually playing recordings of people.
Oh, yeah. So yes, there have. Well, I mean, so it depends what you're referring to when you're saying German Jewish. So Judeo-German is another term that some people use for Yiddish, but most people who speak Yiddish are uncomfortable with that term because Yiddish is so different from German. But it is sometimes used to refer to Western Yiddish, or the language that Jews used in Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Alsace-Lorraine. Actually, the Jewish Language Project is about to post a language description specifically about Alsatian Yiddish, sometimes referred to as Judeo-Alsatian, which is spoken in what's now the Alsace-Lorraine region of eastern France, but it was, occupied by Germans and French people at various points in history. And the Jews there spoke a specific variety of Western Yiddish known as Alsatian Yiddish. And that has been recorded a very little bit, but we have an intern that's currently in that region doing the research. And we recently actually just found, through the miracles of the internet, a community in France, in Paris, of some old people who still speak this language. So we're hoping to record them pretty soon.
Wonderful. And along similar lines, can you differentiate between, you mentioned Judeo-Spanish and also Ladino? Can you sort of differentiate and give us the definitions?
Yeah, so they're words for the same thing. Some people refer to the language spoken by Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire as Ladino. Some call it Judesmo, some call it Judeo-Spanish. So there are various words. In North Africa, it's sometimes referred to as Judeo-Spanish or sometimes as Hakitia, especially in Morocco. And so and who you ask, the answer depends on who you ask.
Carol asks a very interesting question. What role did yeshiva study techniques, and then she gives as example, the recitation of arguments and Talmudic phrases in a lilting manner, impact the development of language in diasporic areas, and did it provide a commonality that transcended the original Hebrew into other language adaptations? You did talk about some pronunciations and rhythms of speech and so on. So I'm guessing that this is in reference to that.
Yeah, well, there are some interesting articles about Talmudic intonation styles and chanting that lead to particular intonation features in language. And there are some distinctive intonation features in Jewish languages around the world. Like I didn't mention this, but in Georgian, often people can tell who's Jewish by the way by their intonation. Like intonation means da 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 da, like the going up and down in your pitch, right? And so in the Talmud, there is no punctuation. So you use your chanting to indicate the phrase boundaries, like da 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 na 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 da. And so you know that when you go down at the end, it's the end of the sentence. And so that actually has an influence on speech. And so the example that I gave of Orthodox intonation, if you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. That's pretty extreme, right? It's kind of chanting. But then you also have more minor versions of it, like, if you're going to the store, get me some milk.
And one more comment from Carol and question. Louis Armstrong, the famous musician, was raised in part by a Jewish family, and some of his musical style is attributed to his early exposure to Yiddish. Are there other musical styles around the world that are clearly impacted by the sounds and vocalizations of Jewish languages?
Ooh, I don't know. That's a good question. I think we should talk to some music experts and have a panel about the mutual influences of music and language.
Perfect. Well, maybe that'll be our next session. And on that note, since we are at the hour, I want to thank you so much for your time and for teaching us. And there's so much more to learn, clearly, but what a gift this work is to our, connections to our ancestors and migration patterns, and also, I've learned a lot about emerging languages, and that gives us a lot of hope and forward-looking insight for our language and culture. So thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. As you leave this program, you will be asked to take a very brief survey. We ask you to take just a minute to fill it out, as your feedback is very helpful for our development of further programs. I invite you to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. And I want to mention that this free program was made possible by contributions to the Jewish Heritage Center and American Ancestors from friends all over the world. We hope that you might consider as well making a donation to support our educational and preservation work. So thank you so much again for joining us. I wish you a good evening. I hope you'll join us again for our next webinar on May 5th. And goodbye until then.